Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to this year's World Aquatic Animal Day on the impact of our human activities on aquatic animals. This is a project of the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative, or AALI, and the Animal Law Clinic at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School. My name is Amy P. Wilson, and I'm the Legal Fellow at the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative and assist with the Animal Law Clinic. My pronouns are she, her. We know it's been a very long day of events, so thank you all for tuning into this final webinar session. Our student legal panel, Humans and Aquatic Animals, Does the Law Keep Us at Bay? We are thrilled to have some of our very own fantastic students for this panel who have assisted us with organizing and implementing the event this year. Thank you all so much for your amazing work. Before we dive into the session, some formalities, and apologies again if you've already heard this a couple of times today. The Zoom is in a webinar format, so you won't be able to see yourself or the other attendees, but only our speakers. You'll be muted, but you can submit your comments and questions, as I'll explain in a little bit. Please note the session will be recorded, and we hope it'll be available in a few weeks, either on our website, www.worldaquaticanimalday.org, or on the Center for Animal Law Studies YouTube channel. For any other information about the events, please check our website or the Facebook page by searching World Aquatic Animal Day. After the presentation, we'll have a brief Q&A, and as you hopefully are aware, you can submit these via the Q&A function located in the control panel on the right side of your screen. And as always, we encourage you to share your attendance at this event on your social media channels using our dedicated hashtag World Aquatic Animal Day. Now, for our awesome speakers, it's my great pleasure to introduce them. First up, we have Caitlin Skurky, who will be discussing why the law excludes aquatic animals, a case study of the Animal Welfare Act's exclusion of cold-blooded aquatic animals. Caitlin is a fourth-year law student at Lewis and Clark Law School. Caitlin works as a clinic intern at the Animal Law Clinic and as a research assistant for clinical professor Kathleen Hessler. For the past 2 years, Caitlin has engaged in a broad range of legal, regulatory, and policy work pertaining to the protection and welfare of aquatic animals. Caitlin previously served as the editor-in-chief of Animal Law Review, student representative for the Student Bar Association's Equity and Inclusion Committee, and has worked at the National Lawyers Guild, the Animal Legal Defense Fund, the Forensic Justice Project, the Oregon Criminal Defense Lawyers Association, and the Oregon Innocence Project. Caitlin seeks to pursue a career dismantling systems of oppression and violence inherent in the legal system to reduce the suffering of human and non-human animals alike. After that, we'll have Mary Hofmann. Mary will be discussing the intersection of environmental law and animal law. Mary's a third-year law student at the University of Toledo College of Law and is currently an extern at the Center for Animal Law Studies. Mary has a bachelor's degree in environmental engineering from the Ohio State University and has continued to advocate for environmental protection and sustainability. She is an articles editor for the University of Toledo Law Review, and her note about criminal liability and environmental law will be published later this year. After graduation, she hopes to protect the environment by helping to bridge the gap between scientific understanding and laws and regulations. In her spare time, Mary enjoys exploring parks and reading. Finally, we'll have Jackson Moffett, and he'll be discussing marine protected areas, how community-driven solutions can protect marine life. Jackson is a first-year law student at Lewis and Clark Law School. Before law school, he served as a Peace Corps volunteer in the Philippines, where he worked on marine protected areas, alternative livelihood development, and founded a youth snorkel club predicated on empowering children to become future stewards of their coastline. Jackson is an avid surfer, paddy dive master, apnea free diver, and a former college football player at UC Berkeley. So I'll end there, and I'm going to hand it over to our wonderful panelists. I'll see everyone back here for the Q&A.
Lovely. Thank you, Amy. So first and foremost, I just want to thank Kathy Hessler and Amy Wilson for creating World Aquatic Animal Day. If it weren't for Kathy and Amy's tireless commitment to improving the treatment and welfare of aquatic animals, none of us would be here today having these extremely important conversations. So thank you, both of you. Today, I'll be talking about the Animal Welfare Act, which I'll refer to as the AWA, and its implicit exclusion of cold-blooded aquatic animals, and the two major impacts that this exclusion has on the welfare of aquatic animals. But before I get started, I'd like to make two quick points for the audience to keep in mind. First, while the AWA only excludes cold-blooded aquatic animals, it's important to remember that the vast majority of aquatic animals are cold-blooded and thus excluded. Second, while I'll only be discussing the AWA today, the audience should remember that this is simply one example, a case study of a much larger, more pervasive issue within our legal system under which aquatic animals, and more often than not, cold-blooded aquatic animals, are either implicitly or explicitly excluded from any legal protection. And this is the case whether we're talking about local anti-cruelty laws or comprehensive federal statutes like the AWA. So to get started, for those of you who don't know, the AWA is the only federal law in the United States that regulates the treatment of animals in research, in exhibition, transport, and by dealers. The AWA specifically sets minimum standards of care and treatment for animals bred for commercial sale, used in research, transported commercially, or exhibited to the public. So we know that cold-blooded animals are used in all of these contexts. So cold-blooded animals are bred in huge numbers for commercial sale, with 250 million goldfish alone being bred every year. They're used in increasingly high numbers in research, with an estimated 15 million fish alone being experimented on every year. And they're transported commercially and they're exhibited to the public. Think about all of the aquariums in the US. But despite the significant use of cold-blooded aquatic animals in all of the relevant areas that the AWA regulates, the AWA implicitly excludes cold-blooded aquatic animals from any protection under the statute. And it does this through its definition of the word animal. So the AWA defines animal in relevant part as any live or dead dog, cat, monkey, guinea pig, hamster, rabbit, or such other warm-blooded animal. And so that phrase, or such other warm-blooded animal, operates to legally exclude cold-blooded aquatic animals from any protection under the AWA. So given the fact that the AWA is the only federal law in the United States that regulates and sets minimum standards of care and treatment for animals in these broad contexts, you can imagine the profound and far-reaching impacts that this exclusion of cold-blooded aquatic animals has on the welfare of such animals. So today I will focus on two major impacts of such an exclusion. First, the exclusion of aquatic animals from the AWA means they are not subject to the Act's record-keeping requirement. This further obfuscates the extent and nature of their use and treatment from both administrative view and the public view. Second, the exclusion of aquatic animals from the AWA means that they are not subject to the Act's record-keeping requirements for humane handling, humane care, humane treatment, and humane transportation of animals. And this has resulted in the large-scale pain, suffering, and death of countless aquatic animals. So let's take a deeper look at the record-keeping requirement. The AWA specifically requires dealers and exhibitors to create and maintain records with respect to the purchase, sale, transportation, identification, and previous ownership of animals. It also creates record-keeping requirements that govern the purchase, handling, or sale of animals in commerce by dealers, research facilities, and by exhibitors. So while the AWA's record-keeping requirement was actually largely created to prevent companion animals from being stolen and then later sold to research facilities, the requirement has since proven to be imperative for both the government and animal interest groups in monitoring compliance with AWA standards and for providing a snapshot of the extent and nature of animal use. So with aquatic animals excluded from the AWA's record-keeping requirements, there is no way of knowing how many aquatic animals are being used in the pet trade, are being used for exhibition, or being used in research. Additionally, there exist no records regarding details of their purchase, how they were transported, or who is selling them. So this lack of information regarding the extent and nature of the use of aquatic animals makes any kind of meaningful reform extremely difficult. So in order to advocate for reduced or modified use, we need to first understand how aquatic animals are currently being used. If we want to advocate for increased welfare, we need to first understand how they're currently being treated. So in this way, preclusion from the record-keeping requirement is not only a consequence of the AWA's exclusion of aquatic animals, but it's also a barrier to any kind of meaningful reform. Now let's take a deeper look at the AWA standards for humane handling, care, treatment, and transportation. The AWA directs the USDA to promulgate standards that govern the humane handling, care, treatment, and transportation of animals by dealers, research facilities, and exhibitors. These standards include minimum requirements for humane handling, humane housing, humane feeding, shelter from extremes of weather and temperatures, and adequate veterinary care, to name a few. Animals and research facilities go even further by including requirements that animal pain and distress are minimized and that adequate veterinary care is available with the use of anesthetic, analgesic, tranquilizing drugs, or euthanasia. So cold-blooded aquatic animals are not subject to any of these very basic minimum standards of humane care and treatment. And so without protection under the AWA, we know that aquatic animals in the commercial pet trade and used for exhibition are notoriously mishandled. They're provided inadequate care, they're treated inhumanely, and they die in huge numbers during transport. So think about pet aquatic animals who can be ordered online and shipped directly to the customer's home. With no protection under the AWA, these animals are handled without any care before or after shipping. They're often shipped in inadequate housing, often small plastic bags. They don't have access to food. And in fact, they're often starved for days before transport to avoid them vomiting or excreting in the bags. They're subject to extreme temperatures, and they have no veterinary care. And in fact, to the contrary, many fish have their dorsal spines cut off to avoid piercing the bag during transit. And so aquatic animals used for exhibition, including aquariums and pet stores, face these same issues during transport. But the impact of precluding aquatic animals from the AWA standards for humane care and treatment are perhaps most acute for aquatic animals used in research facilities who face unfathomable pain and suffering as they're violently handled. They suffer from brutal experimentations with little to no aftercare, and they suffer injury and death during transport. So with no protection from the AWA, in fact, many aquatic animals are experimented on without ensuring that pain and distress are minimized and without providing any adequate veterinary care or any use of anesthetic, analgesic, tranquilizing drugs, or even euthanasia. It's worth noting that some aquatic animals, specifically live vertebrates used in federally funded research, are provided with a minimal protection under something called the Public Health Services Policy, or the PHS policy. But this policy does not cover aquatic animals who are invertebrates like mollusks and echinoderms, and the policy is largely self-policing. So facilities simply provide a document asserting that they are in compliance with the policy, and then the office that oversees the policy simply takes facilities at their word. And furthermore, while the office may do on-site inspections, even if they find a facility is found out of compliance, it's up to the facility to take remedial action itself. And in fact, there's no required follow-up inspection. So in this way, the PHS policy for the few aquatic animals that it does cover is not an adequate alternative to the statutory protection of the AWA. So with an estimated 15 million fish being experimented on every year, including such cruel experiments as having holes drilled into their skulls and steel coils implanted in their eyes, having a statutory minimum standard of care and treatment is imperative. But without any protection under the AWA, countless aquatic animals are destined to experience pain and suffering on a scale that's hard to imagine. And without any record-keeping requirements, we can't even quantify how many aquatic animals are relegated to such an existence, or really know with any certainty the extent of the inhumanity that they face. So again, this is just one example of the far-reaching impacts of a systemic issue within our legal system under which aquatic animals are excluded from legal protection, and more often than not, cold-blooded aquatic animals specifically. And while I don't have time to discuss in detail the philosophical and sociological underpinnings of this problematic socially constructed hierarchy between warm-blooded aquatic animals and cold-blooded aquatic animals, suffice it to say that this hierarchy exists not only within our legal system, but within the scientific community, within our everyday socially discursive practices, and even within the animal protection movement itself. And in this way, the hierarchy is self-reinforcing as the law reinforces science, science reinforces the law and science reinforce our culture, and the animal protection movement operates within the bounds of law, science, and cultural norms. So I'm aware that my talk is wildly depressing, and while I don't have time to talk about potential solutions in detail, I do want to assure folks that there are various possible solutions to the exclusion of aquatic animals from legal protection. In regards to the AWA, we could amend the definition of animal to include cold-blooded aquatic animals, though it's worth noting that such an amendment would face several legal, practical, and enforcement complications, as well as several risks that may in fact worsen welfare standards for aquatic animals. If anyone's interested in hearing more about these potential solutions, risks, and complications, please feel free to drop a question in the Q&A box. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mary Hofmann, and I am a third-year law student at the University of Toledo College of Law. As you heard, my background is very heavily environmental, so today I will be talking on how human impacts on the environment are affecting aquatic animals. Please note that this is a very expansive topic, and as such, this presentation is very, very limited in scope. We've talked a lot today about plastic pollution and its impacts on aquatic animals, but that's only a portion of the anthropogenic pollution problem. Take oil and gas, for example. Approximately 600,000 metric tons of oil is released into the ocean annually, much of which is natural seepage rather than in concentrated oil spill events. Crude oil can cause issues with heart development and cardiac activity in aquatic animals, as well as affect biological cues. Drilling and mining wastes include heavy metals and large amounts of organic material. Beyond the direct impact that these carcinogens have on aquatic animals, they also result to changes in the environment, such as changes in temperature and pH. The repetitive depressurization and pressurization of offshore drilling can also affect the aerobic metabolism of fish. Lastly, the sewage and discharge and agricultural runoff are concerns largely because of the nutrients that they're introducing to aquatic ecosystems. They present a myriad of issues depending on the nutrient, but to name a few, they're potentially toxic to aquatic species. They can cause calcification, changes in water salinity, and oxygen levels, which can cause algal blooms. Pollution more broadly also contributes to another major environmental concern, climate change. As we all know, climate change is a huge and very complex issue. So again, this is going to be very, very narrow. On the slide are 3 of the major environmental consequences of climate change that have huge effects on aquatic animals. The most well-known is that global atmospheric and ocean temperatures are rising. First and foremost, all organisms have a window of temperatures that they can survive in. And within this window, changes in temperature can affect metabolic activities. Species that are already living near the top of their thermal window, such as corals, are in a very dangerous position. Those species that can relocate are migrating to cooler temperatures, but this is also causing problems with invasive species. And as the Arctic is warming twice as fast as the global average, the livable habitat options for aquatic species are decreasing. Changing ocean temperatures can also affect biological cues for reproduction, migration, and other seasonal activities for aquatic species. Climate change is also resulting in changes to seawater chemistry. Increases of carbon dioxide can lower water pH, which causes acidification. Increased dissolved organic carbon loading and oxygen concentrations are dependent on temperature, anabolic activity, and biomass, which all fluctuate with climate change. Additionally, as freshwater ice caps melt, ocean salinity and density are decreasing. Lastly, climate change is impacting precipitation patterns, altering the timing and volume of rain events, as well as exacerbating extreme events. Rain patterns can affect stream flow, water quality and salinity, and the existence of seasonal water bodies. Extreme precipitation events can cause flooding and increased runoff, pollution, or on the other extreme, droughts. As an oversimplified background for those not familiar with how federal environmental law works in the United States, we have statutes and we have regulations. Congress passes a statute and then gives a federal agency the power to create regulations that support the broader purpose or goal of the statute. Then either the federal agency oversees implementation and enforcement of those regulations, or they can delegate it to a state agency. States also generally have the option to go beyond these federal minimum requirements, making stricter environmental requirements in their own jurisdictions. The major laws that we have in place from the early 1970s were successful for their time. However, it's clear that right now, our current system is failing to adequately protect the environment and animals. This is both because our laws are not strict nor comprehensive enough, and because environmental law has long been considered soft law and less important than other fields. Specifically, environmental law is, at its core, anthropocentric. It was created solely looking at nature's value for humans rather than an intrinsic value. Environmental laws are also fragmented and organized by resource, which means that they are enforced by different agencies and individuals rather than as one system that protects an interrelated environmental ecosystem. On a wider scale, the UN reports that the primary issue is a global failure to implement and enforce environmental laws. And as you can see on the slide, this was reflected in the United States, at least in the previous administration's greatly reducing of EPA's enforcement activities. Despite these failings, we've gone 30 years without any new major advancements or expansions. So why is it that we're failing to take action? When the major environmental acts were passed, they had overwhelming bipartisan support. Environmentalism, conservation, climate change, these have all increasingly become more and more politicized, which makes it harder to get laws passed. A 2020 poll showed that 60% of American voters considered climate change a threat, which was up from the last decade, but the increased concern is still largely concentrated among one party. However, even within these that support further environmental legislation, environmental issues often take the back seat to other pressing social concerns. We obviously need to see changes in our environmental laws in order to adequately protect aquatic animals, but how do we get there? The UN advocates that we should start by framing environmental law as a human right, which would help support environmental protection and sustainable development projects, especially in more vulnerable communities. We also need stronger enforcement of acts that focus on the system rather than individual pollutants or media. There are also specific legal initiatives that could greatly help strengthen environmental law. We talked very briefly about the 30 by 30 during the virtual action hour, which is the goal to conserve 30% of our land and ocean globally by 2030 in order to give ecosystems the resiliency to combat climate change and anthropogenic issues. Another example of a legal step forward would be global rights of nature movements, which seek legal recognition that ecosystems, such as the ocean and animals, have rights intrinsically just as humans do. Ecuador, for example, recently became the first country to recognize rights of nature in its constitution. Lastly, ideally, environmental issues would not be partisan and political. Unfortunately, we've seen that this is not the case right now. But as long as we're still fighting for institutional change, we can also be continuously working to educate people on these issues, their vast implications, and the urgency with which we need to tackle them. I believe that we need to expand this understanding that environmental issues really do affect every part of our existence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary and Caitlin. I appreciate being able to be last but not least, and we're going to dive into marine protected areas and how community-driven solutions can protect marine life. We really talked a lot about institutional change and really ways the law can serve marine life. And this presentation is going to cover a little bit more about a more grassroots approach and really how we can work with existing fishing communities. So my experience is rooted in my 2.5 years that I spent in the Philippines as a Peace Corps volunteer. Where I lived was in the northern section of the country known as Ilocos Sur. The Philippines is comprised of more than 7,000 islands and has 83 different languages. And so people have vast different experiences living in different parts of the Philippines. But one thing that all Filipinos share is that, you are in, the capital of the ocean, and fishing and farming are like a way of life, and it's a way of culture. And so anybody coming in as an outsider, whether you're working with an NGO or working as a Peace Corps volunteer, it's pretty imperative that you kind of gather an understanding of that culture and see things the way that they see them before proposing any solutions, whether it's to agricultural practices or ways to save the ocean and save fish. So the first part of living in the Philippines and really being a volunteer was really integrating into my community. And that was because before I could suggest a marine protected area, also known as fish sanctuaries, no take zones, essentially blocking off a portion of the sea so that way we won't fish from there so it can naturally rehabilitate. You really need to do things that almost don't relate to fishing in order to show that you're not an outsider just trying to, implement a top-down solution, but really doing a needs-based approach. And so I spent the first year doing things like spending time on the rice farm or doing tobacco farming. I would just spend time snorkeling with kids and honestly spending a lot of time having coffee with moms or having gin with fishermen late at night. But without gaining the support of the community, it would have been impossible for me to even get their attention and talk to them about, hey, how can we take a part of the reef that you and your father and their father's father have been fishing on for generations, and to stop fishing there for a while and hope that more fish are going to come back in the future. So I'm really glad that there's been a lot of touch on kind of connecting to the natural world and seeing that nature isn't something that we can control, but it's something that we need to live with, and it's something that needs to be a part of us if we're really going to try to live in a world that still has fish. Free diving has kind of been a staple and something that's really been the foundation for me, and really something that I've always led with, and kind of how I was ultimately able to get my community around implementing a marine protected area. When I'm underwater and with the fish, I don't have a scuba tank on. I don't have any apparatus separating me from the fish. And something that Professor Frank said earlier was, when you go down underwater, these systems, these fish are living in robust communities underwater. And I would go down to the same reef every day and I see the same grouper hanging out under a cave, or I see the same couple octopi hid into another little crevice. And you start to grow a real attachment for that underwater city and really see that they live their own life that has its own rights and something that needs to be protected. And it's so special. And I can't imagine living in a world without it. So why marine protected areas? The World Wildlife Fund estimates that for every dollar that we were to invest in establishing MPAs, we would be yielding $3 in revenue. And that's for a variety of reasons. Number one, a big one is coastal protection. While the average person might think things like seawalls are really big for coastal protection, coral reefs, which are animals, are really the biggest things that can protect coastal communities from ongoing storms. And as climate change creates not only more storms, but it intensifies them each year, it's imperative that we do everything that we can in order to keep that coral reef there, to slow down those waves when those storms come. And something that MPAs can do is that you can keep fish rehabilitating that reef so it doesn't kind of turn into an over algae grown graveyard. Naturally, another benefit is fisheries. It takes about 10 years for a marine protected area to fully flourish. But when it does, is you have a quote unquote spillover effect. And then you have other fish kind of habitating the reef outside of that no take zone. And so fishermen are still getting that same return on fish, yet you're still having fish that are completely blocked off from any fishing. So it's a win-win for everybody. And in terms on the jobs, We've spoken a little bit about ecotourism and how it can be really dangerous and it can be really harmful to marine life, but it's a double-edged sword in which it can also be done right. And if you put into a place where in marine protected areas where only limited free diving's done, snorkeling, scuba diving, where boats aren't allowed to park in the actual no-take zone, then you can actually have an economic boost to the community. And so not only do you have fishermen benefiting, but you also have people that don't fish getting some type of income from implementing the MPA. So on the surface, it kind of sounds like marine protected areas might be almost a save all legal solution, something that, why don't we have more of these? Well, there's a lot of challenges. You'll see here on the photo, this is actually a photo of me during my first public hearing after months and months of riding my bicycle up and down the coast, pleading with fishermen to come to my meeting to talk about establishing a new marine protected area. Fishermen are gone 12 to 16 hours a day and they are exhausted when they get back. And the last thing they want to do is be woken up from their nap to be placed in a plastic chair to hear some American tell them about why they can't fish anymore. But, you know, unfortunately, the reality we live in is that we need protections for fish and we need to find a way to sustain their livelihood. And so we had to find that middle ground. But aside from gaining community support, establishing proper ordinances is a major challenge. A lot of MPAs are quote unquote paper MPAs in which a legal instrument is drafted, but they don't offer any protection. Oftentimes there'll be things like wrong GPS coordinates will be placed on the actual ordinance. And so say a commercial fishing boat were to take fish from that MPA, if you have the wrong GPS coordinates, then you can't really enforce any legal action on them because on paper, they technically didn't fish in a no-take zone. But say you have a good ordinance and you have community support, you still need effective regulation against illegal fishing. And right now, all marine protected areas in the Philippines operate what's known as a bantay dagat system, which is a voluntary sea patrolman. And so essentially you have fishermen volunteering on their own time to stay the night at watchtowers, stay at the watchtower during the day, kind of keep their eyes on the marine protected area, which if there's no illegal fishing can be a very boring job. And a lot of times there's not a lot of funding put in place to actually pay the fishermen. And so illegal fishing is rampant. And unfortunately, only about a third of marine protected areas right now in the Philippines are actually successful due to lack of regulation. One time I was on a scuba dive and I actually heard a dynamite blast into a reef while I was on my own dive. Other things we would see is we'd see a lot of cyanide poisoning. And then fishermen, when they're doing illegal fishing, they'll also use compressors in which they'll use a compressor engine, grab a hose and be able to sneak into the sanctuary at night and then just have a turkey shoot and kill as many fish as they want. So you might have funding up front, but sustainable funding is another challenge. And so even after we crafted the ordinances to actually get the marine protected area established, you still need to implement a 10-year financing plan and get that approved either through the municipality or through the province that you're working with. But even if you have the money and you have the fishermen brought in and you have a proper ordinance, you still need an established management plan and a committee, people that are going to do things like check for buoys when they're not stolen, make sure that people aren't using the beach in the marine protected area and putting single-use plastics in the water, things of that nature. So these were the two marine protected areas that we had in the Philippines in my community. The San Esteban Fish Sanctuary was already established. However, it lacked a proper ordinance. And so we had to rewrite that ordinance. And secondly, it didn't have any buoys. And so fishermen would often get away with fishing because they didn't know where that boundary line was. And earlier, there was some chat about the different types of fish sanctuaries, and the Apatot Shipwreck Sanctuary is an example for that. The shipwreck was a World War II Japanese shipwreck, and our main concern was just protecting that so we would operate as an artificial reef to bring back fish. And so what we had to do was I kind of had to barter with the fishermen, and you'll see, I apologize, there's some Ilocano words because this was a map I used for the fishermen there, but pana means like spearfishing in Tagalog. And so we had to see that spearfishing was okay in this buffer zone, but in the core zone, it's where it says may pari ti akala, that just says like any fishing is like illegal. And so through finding a way to work with the fishermen, listen to them, understand that like they still needed to spearfish, but we wanted to protect that ship, you're able to have a little bit of flexibility on what type of marine protected areas you're going to implement and what the size of them are going to be. So this is your typical MPA roadmap. And unfortunately, most sanctuaries never escape that level 1 grading, because you need things like a proper baseline assessment. You actually have a management plan adopted, your ordinances are all in check, and you have that management body meeting quarterly, and you also have a budget allocated. And this is the main reason why most MPAs fails, is because a lot of them don't reach that first threshold. And it's because a lot of these are rushed. Community support is very, very vital. And if you don't have the support of the fishing community, any action you have to try to protect that reef is ultimately going to fail. And that's why top-down approaches, whether it's from a government initiative or from a nonprofit coming in and trying to put in like a quick fix, those are ultimately going to fail. And unfortunately, like the sad truth is that, you know, fishermen are the people that have been living there forever. They actually know the sea, and their families are going to live there forever. And it's imperative that we get their support, listen to them, and kind of see what a sustainable future looks like. But there are success stories. And when you do have those success stories, after 4, 5, 6 years, the community starts to see the returns. They start to see the fish coming back. They see there's less visitors on those beaches, so people aren't using things like single-use plastics. You're not having boats dropping anchors, damaging those reefs. And so you really see a reef coming back to life, which is a beautiful thing to see. But in order to really have a thriving MPA and a thriving reef, you need to create long-term support for that marine protection. And so this was one of the reasons why we started a community snorkel club, is that we kind of had this idea of, if we can get the children of the community hooked on how magical this reef is right now, then they can be those change agents 10, 20 years down the road. And so when we're looking for people to be the sea patrolman or sit on the management board, you're going to have a whole population of people that grew up snorkeling in caves, playing with groups of parrotfish, seeing octopus in the reef, and they're going to want to support that, and they're going to want to support it forever. So the key takeaways in marine protected areas in this very short crash course is that they take time and they take funding, and that community support is absolutely vital. And the number one place you should start is simply speaking with fishermen, speaking with their families, understanding their needs, and seeing what the future looks like going forward before doing any legal instrument writing or throwing any money at the solutions. Thank you so much for listening to this short but rushed crash course on marine protected areas, my experience in the Philippines. I've dropped down my contact information if anybody wants to ask questions about the Peace Corps, the Philippines, or marine protected areas in general. Thank you so much for listening.
Great, thank you so much for all of those presentations. I think we covered a lot of different ground. There's a lot to learn from all of this. So we have a couple questions. I was going to start with the first one for Mary specifically, and it relates to whether we've seen international support for the 30 by 30 commitment.
Yeah, we have seen some commitment to start. There is a high ambition coalition for nature and people that includes 51 countries that are committed to pursuing the 30 by 30 at a national and global level. Additionally, in the United States, in a January executive order, President Biden committed to conserving 30% of the United States' land and oceans by 2030 as well. We've yet to see any specific advancements in that, but it's starting to take hold.
That's great, and it's very positive. So the next one I assume is for Caitlin. Can you talk about some of the potential challenges to amending the definition of animal in the AWA to include cold-blooded animals?
Yeah, so there would definitely be several challenges to passing such an amendment. I think first and foremost, the USDA would face a massive undertaking in determining minimum standards of care and treatment for the many different types of animals that fall under the category of cold-blooded aquatic animals. And so just for an example, the term cold-blooded aquatic animal, that includes a diverse range of animals, including fish, amphibians, crustaceans, echinoderms, mollusks, and reptiles, just to name a few. And each of those types of animals all have a plethora of species. So for example, last I checked, which was 2019, there were 33,600 different species of fish alone. And there are a diverse range of biological needs for each species, meaning that the USDA would need to come up with standards that are not only animal specific, but species specific. And studies have shown that some fish even require species specific anesthetics. So you can just imagine, figuring this out would be extremely difficult. And then enforcing it would also be difficult because last time I checked, again in 2019, there were only 115 USDA inspectors who oversaw more than 7,750 licensed facilities. And so all of a sudden adding billions of aquatic animals under the AWA's protection means that these 115 inspectors would have to all of a sudden oversee all of these new billions of animals and new licensed facilities that would now fall under the AWA. So that's just, a couple examples, and there are of course others.
Great, thank you. I think the idea of changing the law sometimes, especially as lawyers, sounds fantastic, but the practicalities of them are a little bit different. Great, so this one is for Jackson. Can you say a little bit about how you are working for the protection of the animals while you are still in law school?
Certainly. So this summer, I'll be interning with the National Oceanic Atmospheric Association in Hawaii with their Pacific Island section. Specifically, we'll be working with tuna regulation. So the Western Pacific Marine Council, what we do is they work with representatives from every island nation in the Pacific. You have people coming from Tonga, Fiji. You also have representatives from Guam, Saipan. And what you do is you kind of have a meeting between fishermen saying how many tuna they're catching. You have the scientists saying, this is how many fish are left. And then you have the lawyers kind of saying, okay, let's find the middle ground on kind of establishing what the law is going to be going forward. And there's a funny quote that I was told in which, if you're not leaving the table with both the fishermen and the scientists both mad, then it's not good policy, because you want the fishermen not feeling like they have too many fish to catch, but you don't want scientists feeling like our science is being completely disregarded. So as a legal extern, what I'll be doing is I'll be sitting in on those meetings, but I'll also be assisting in any environmental litigation that happens, specifically acts of illegal fishing, people fishing above their quotas, or people fishing in no-take zones. But that's kind of where my career will start in terms of protecting marine life.
Sounds amazing. Good luck with that. Great. So another one for Mary. Given that the protection of aquatic animals is a transboundary issue, do you foresee more regulation on an international scale? Will we see the equivalent of an International Marine Mammal Protection Act?
International law is not my specialty, but I know that the major issue is that each country only really has control over a small amount of area right off of their continental shelf, and enforcement in international law is always very difficult unless we had a huge coalition of countries that was willing to work together. Any international aquatic animal protection would be very complicated and have a lot of moving parts.
Most definitely. I think that's what is one of the challenges with international law. But I do believe there are some efforts to create a lot more protected areas between two countries or more, so more kind of bilateral ones, which make them a little bit more manageable. So there's a lot of very exciting efforts on that front. So I hope to see a bit more of that. And what I wanted to ask all of you kind of individually before we wrap up was, we've spoken a lot about the law, which is fantastic, but for people that aren't lawyers or aren't involved within the legal and regulatory system, and they're interested in protecting aquatic animals and aquatic life and their environments, what are some of the ways that you might suggest that they can do this in their personal lives? And any of you can answer it.
I guess I'll just start simple, which is number one, I always encourage people to get in the water as much as they can. I think whether it's a nearby river, a lake, or the ocean, just simply interacting with fish gives you a greater respect for that life. And anytime you go out to a restaurant, always ask the chef, where does he get his fish? Ask them, are they doing it commercially, or is it being locally caught? And ask your friends to think twice next time before they go to a $10 all-you-can-eat sushi bar.
I think my biggest thing is just do your research. Even as a law student, there's a lot of things that I don't understand, but there are so many great resources out there. If there's an issue that you're interested in, just look it up and start small. And there's so much that you can learn in little steps that everybody can be taking.
Yeah, I think, I really care about cold-blooded aquatic animals, obviously. And so I think my answer will be a little specific to that. But I think that something that people can do is try to destroy that problematic hierarchy that keeps reinforcing itself when it comes to warm-blooded marine mammals and cold-blooded aquatic animals. So talking about the fact that cold-blooded aquatic animals like fish and crustaceans and amphibians and reptiles are worthy of protection. You don't need to be a lawyer to sit at the dinner table, though it's uncomfortable, and to talk about some of these things, to talk about the fact that there are scientific studies that show that cold-blooded aquatic animals, not just marine mammals, are capable of feeling pain, have really complex social structures, are able to empathize, and to really get folks jazzed about these animals. And yeah, take down the hierarchy one step at a time if you can.
Nice, I love that. Well, I'm going to close with that, getting jazzed for the animals, because I think that's a extremely positive way for us to end the day. And really that concludes our panel webinar session for the day. I want to thank all of you for your wonderful presentations and of course all your work on this. It's very exciting to see the things that you're doing. So just going forward for the rest of the day, in about an hour at about 5 p.m. Pacific time, we'll be heading to our final event, which is a screening, a Netflix watch party of the groundbreaking new documentary Seaspiracy. I really encourage you to see that. We've spoken a lot about protecting these animals, but I think unless you have the visual kind of effect of seeing it, it makes a very big difference. So this event is hosted by our community partners, Veggies Do It Better, ARC PDX, and the Ocean Research and Conservation Alliance of Lewis and Clark Law School. And it's on a different link. So please go back to the website to get those details. And just to kind of end off, we at the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative and the Animal Law Clinic at the Center for Animal Law Studies really and truly appreciate all of you joining us for this event. Even though World Aquatic Animal Day is only one day a year, we can continue to protect and advocate for them each and every single day through our own actions. Unless we make an active effort in our own lives to educate ourselves and others, as well as make the necessary changes, we are going to continue to exacerbate all of these issues that we've discussed today over time. And we really need to step it up and be active and encourage others to do the same. And aquatic animals are important, valuable, and critical for our survival. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Professor Hessler for some final closing thoughts.
I wanted to just thank our wonderful speakers, our moderators, on behalf, again, as Amy said, of the Aquatic Law Initiative, the Animal Law Clinic, the Center for Animal Law Studies, to everyone who participated throughout the day. We've had amazing speakers. Our moderators have been great. Special thanks to Megan Senatori from CALS and Henry, our AV guru, who's been behind the scenes all day. Thank you, Henry. And to all of you who have participated in one way or another. And just again, as a reminder, it doesn't stop here. We want to continue the conversation, continue the education. So as Amy has said, you can go onto the website. There's the information that's already there. The resource packet we haven't talked much about. There's a lot of information there that's helpful. Recordings of today's sessions will be linked there and on the CALS YouTube. The CALS Facebook event page has information. For folks who are interested, especially on the legal side, interested in taking a deeper dive, so to speak, we'll be teaching the Aquatic Animal Law course again this summer. It's an online course, so folks can join us this summer to talk about it more. So I think that's it. We appreciate everyone's participation. We look forward to hearing more about what's been going on around the world. We know there's been a lot of activity with the hashtag. Lots of organizations have had their own events, and we're really anxious to learn more. Until then, so we'll see people tonight for the Seaspiracy. And we'll look forward to having folks join us again next year, April 3rd, 2022, for our third World Aquatic Animal Day. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your day.